Commander Zethikar stood before the large viewing screen in his ship's command center. The stars stretched out before him like tiny diamonds scattered across black cloth. He had seen this view thousands of times during his 20 years with the Galactic Observation Corps. Today felt no different from any other assignment. His communication device buzzed with an incoming message. The holographic image of High Commander Vrextal appeared, his 6 eyes blinking in sequence as he spoke. "Commander Zethikar, you have new orders," the High Commander said. His voice carried the weight of authority that came from centuries of service. "The Galactic Council requires detailed observations of a military conflict." Zethikar nodded. This was routine work for someone with his experience. He had watched dozens of species fight their wars. Some were quick and efficient. Others dragged on for years. All followed predictable patterns that the Council used to understand different civilizations. "Which species are involved this time?" Zethikar asked, already preparing his recording equipment. "The humans," Vrextal replied. "They're fighting the Vorthak Collective for control of a colony world called New Austin." Zethikar had heard of humans before. They were a relatively new species that had only recently discovered faster-than-light travel. Most reports described them as average in almost every way. They weren't particularly strong or smart. Their technology was primitive compared to established galactic civilizations. Their military tactics seemed basic and predictable. "The humans are greatly outnumbered," Vrextal continued. "Intelligence reports suggest they have no chance of victory. The Vorthak possess superior weapons and defensive systems. This should be a short conflict." "Understood," Zethikar said. "I'll document their surrender procedures and final military actions. The Council will have complete records within a few days." Vrextal's image flickered slightly. "There's one more thing. The humans have been fighting for 3 weeks already. They should have surrendered by now, but they continue to resist." This surprised Zethikar. Most species recognized when defeat was certain and sought terms to minimize casualties. Perhaps the humans were simply too primitive to understand basic military mathematics. "I'll investigate their reasoning," Zethikar said. "Some younger species need time to accept reality." After the communication ended, Zethikar set course for the New Austin system. His ship, the Silent Watcher, was equipped with advanced cloaking technology that would keep him invisible to both sides of the conflict. He could observe everything without influencing the outcome. The journey took 2 days. During this time, Zethikar reviewed available information about humans. They came from a small blue planet called Earth. Their bodies were typical for carbon-based life forms. 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 head. They had developed nuclear weapons before space travel, which was common but not impressive. Their military history showed constant warfare among themselves. This was also normal for developing species. What caught Zethikar's attention was how long their wars lasted. Many species fought brief, decisive conflicts. Human wars sometimes continued for years or even decades. When the Silent Watcher arrived at New Austin, Zethikar positioned his ship in high orbit above the main continent. His sensors immediately picked up signs of heavy fighting below. Explosions lit up the planet's surface like angry fireflies. Energy weapons created bright streaks across the landscape. The Vorthak had established 3 major fortified positions. Their defensive shields glowed blue against the planet's orange sky. These barriers could stop most known weapons. Inside the protected zones, Vorthak soldiers moved with the confidence of a superior force. Human forces were scattered across the continent in smaller groups. Their positions looked weak compared to the Vorthak strongholds. Zethikar's sensors detected primitive kinetic weapons and basic explosive devices. Against plasma artillery and energy shields, such equipment seemed almost useless. Admiral Jake Collins commanded the human forces from a mobile command ship that kept moving to avoid enemy fire. Zethikar intercepted several of Collins' communications with his ground commanders. The Admiral's voice remained steady despite his disadvantageous position. "All units maintain current positions," Collins ordered during one transmission. "We're not giving up another inch of ground." Zethikar found this puzzling. A competent commander would be planning strategic withdrawals to preserve forces. Instead, Collins seemed determined to hold territory that couldn't be defended. The Vorthak commander, War Prime Gorthek, had defeated 30 other species during his career. His forces controlled the planet's main cities and industrial centers. Victory appeared certain, yet the humans refused to acknowledge this reality. Zethikar began recording detailed observations. He noted troop movements, weapon effectiveness, and casualty rates. The numbers painted a clear picture. Human losses were mounting daily while Vorthak casualties remained minimal. Any rational analysis suggested the conflict would end within days. During his first week of observation, Zethkar watched several small battles. Human soldiers fought with standard tactics learned from military academies across the galaxy. They took cover, coordinated attacks, and retreated when facing overwhelming force. Nothing suggested they were different from other species he had studied. The only unusual behavior came from their medical personnel. Human doctors and medics repeatedly risked their lives to treat wounded soldiers under enemy fire. Most species considered such actions wasteful. Medical staff were valuable resources that shouldn't be endangered unnecessarily. Dr. Amy Foster particularly caught Zethkar's attention. She was a young physician attached to the 3rd Marine Battalion. During one engagement, her unit came under heavy plasma fire. Standard procedure called for medical personnel to evacuate to safe zones. Instead, Foster remained with the wounded, treating injuries while explosions erupted around her position. When her commanding officer ordered her to retreat, Foster refused. "These soldiers need immediate care," she transmitted back. "I won't abandon them." Zethkar made notes about this behavior. Perhaps humans had different values regarding individual life. Some species were more willing to sacrifice members for the greater good. Others preserved each individual at great cost to overall efficiency. Captain Lisa Martinez led the 3rd Marine Battalion that Dr. Foster served with. Zethkar observed her preparing her troops for what appeared to be another hopeless assault against Vorthak positions. The enemy's energy shields had proven impenetrable to human weapons. Previous attacks had failed with heavy casualties, yet Martinez addressed her soldiers with confidence. "Tomorrow we're going to break their lines," she told them. "I know it looks impossible, but we've got something they don't understand." Zethkar wondered what advantage Martinez thought she possessed. Human technology was inferior. Their numbers were smaller. Their position was deteriorating daily. What could possibly give her such confidence? Sergeant Roy Campbell commanded one of Martinez's squads. He was a veteran soldier who had fought in several previous conflicts. His service record showed bravery and competence, but nothing exceptional. During equipment checks, Campbell inspected weapons that seemed inadequate for the coming battle. "Make sure your bayonets are sharp," Campbell told his men. "We might need them tomorrow." This confused Zethkar even more. Bayonets were primitive melee weapons attached to rifles. Against energy shields and plasma weapons, they would be completely useless. Why would an experienced sergeant prepare such obsolete equipment? As night fell over New Austin, both armies settled into defensive positions. Vorthak forces remained secure behind their energy barriers. Human troops huddled in trenches and makeshift shelters exposed to the planet's harsh weather. Zethkar completed his first detailed report. Everything suggested the conflict would end soon with human defeat. War Prime Gorthek had superior numbers, better technology, and stronger defensive positions. The humans had courage, but courage alone rarely determined battle outcomes. Tomorrow would likely bring the final assault that broke human resistance. Zethkar prepared his equipment to record their surrender. Such documentation would help the Galactic Council understand how primitive species faced inevitable defeat. He had no way of knowing that everything he thought he understood about warfare was about to change forever. Dawn broke over New Austin with the sound of human artillery. Zethkar activated his recording equipment as explosions erupted across the battlefield. The human bombardment was fierce but largely ineffective against Vorthak energy shields. Bright flashes of light marked where shells struck the protective barriers and dissolved harmlessly. War Prime Gorthek's forces responded with plasma artillery. Purple beams of superheated energy carved deep trenches in the ground where human soldiers had been moments before. The technological advantage was obvious. Each Vorthak shot could eliminate entire squads while human weapons barely scratched enemy defenses. Captain Lisa Martinez gave the attack order at exactly 600 hours. "All units advance on the primary target. Break their center line." Zethkar watched through his sensors as human soldiers emerged from their positions. They moved in standard formation across open ground toward the nearest Vorthak stronghold. Their advance was methodical and professional, exactly what he expected from trained military personnel. The Vorthak defenders opened fire immediately. Plasma beams swept across the battlefield like deadly searchlights. Where they touched, the ground turned to glass. Human soldiers fell in groups, their primitive armor offering no protection against such advanced weapons. Any rational species would retreat at this point. The attack was clearly failing with massive casualties and no apparent benefit. Zethkar prepared to document the human withdrawal and subsequent surrender negotiations. Instead, something unprecedented happened. Sergeant Roy Campbell's squad was pinned down behind a small ridge about halfway to the Vorthak position. Plasma fire kept them trapped while their numbers dwindled. Campbell tried radio communication with his commanding officer, but the transmission was cut short by nearby explosions. Standard military doctrine required Campbell to retreat with his remaining men. The position was untenable and the mission had failed. Any reasonable commander would preserve his forces for future operations. Campbell stood up instead. "Fix bayonets," he shouted to his squad. "We're going straight through their shields." Zethkar thought he had misunderstood the human language. Bayonets were primitive stabbing weapons. Energy shields were sophisticated defensive barriers. The two technologies existed centuries apart in development. Using one against the other was not just ineffective, it was impossible. Campbell's soldiers attached their bayonets without question. These men understood the futility of their weapons better than anyone. They had seen plasma beams melt steel and turn rock to vapor, yet they prepared to charge directly into such firepower with nothing but knives attached to their rifles. "Follow me," Campbell yelled, jumping over the ridge. His remaining 8 soldiers followed immediately. They ran straight toward the Vorthak energy shield, screaming what Zethkar's translator identified as battle cries. Plasma beams cut down 3 men before they reached the barrier. The survivors smashed into the energy field with their bayonets raised. The impossible happened. The Vorthak shield flickered and failed. Zethkar checked his sensors 3 times to confirm the reading. Energy shields were not supposed to react to primitive metal weapons. The technology was designed to stop advanced projectiles and energy attacks. A simple knife should pass through without any effect on the barrier's stability. Yet Campbell's bayonet had somehow disrupted the entire defensive system. The sergeant and his remaining men poured through the gap in the shield. Vorthak soldiers inside the perimeter scattered in confusion. These defenders were prepared to face modern weapons from a distance. They had no training for close combat with primitive blades. Campbell's bayonet found the nearest Vorthak warrior. The alien's advanced armor was designed to deflect energy weapons, but it offered little protection against a sharp piece of steel driven by desperate strength. The defender fell with a sound of surprise and pain. Other human soldiers exploited the breakthrough. Captain Martinez led her reserve platoon through the gap Campbell had created. Lieutenant Ben Harrison's fighter squadron dove through the opening in the shield to attack Vorthak positions from inside their own defenses. Harrison's aircraft was already damaged from ground fire. His left engine burned with black smoke while warning lights flashed across his control panel. Standard procedure required immediate return to base for emergency repairs. Harrison ignored the warnings. He aimed his crippled fighter directly at the Vorthak command tower. "This is Lightning 7, he transmitted to his squadron. "I'm going in." "Negative, Lightning 7, came the reply from his wing commander. "Your aircraft is critically damaged. Eject immediately." "Can't do that, sir. They need this tower gone." Zethkar watched in fascination as Harrison pushed his failing fighter into a steep dive toward the enemy command center. The human pilot could have ejected to safety at any moment. His ejection seat was functioning normally. Rescue teams were standing by to recover downed pilots. Instead, Harrison rode his burning aircraft straight into the Vorthak tower. The explosion was tremendous. The command center collapsed in a shower of debris and flame. Harrison's fighter disappeared in the blast, taking the pilot with it. The loss of their command post threw the Vorthak defenders into chaos just as human ground forces pressed their attack. Zethkar struggled to understand what he had witnessed. Harrison had deliberately killed himself to destroy an enemy position. This was not the calculated sacrifice of a valuable resource for strategic gain. This was something else entirely. The battle continued throughout the morning. Dr. Amy Foster worked frantically to treat wounded soldiers as they were carried back from the fighting. Her medical station was dangerously close to the combat zone, well within range of stray plasma fire. "Doctor, we need to evacuate this position," her medical assistant warned. "The fighting is moving this way." Foster looked up from the soldier she was treating. His leg was badly burned by plasma fire, but he would survive if he received proper care. Moving him now might kill him. We stay until this man is stable, she decided. But doctor, it's not safe here. It's not safe for our soldiers out there either, Foster replied, returning to her patient. They're fighting for us. The least we can do is be here when they need us. A plasma beam struck the ground 50 meters from the medical station. The explosion showered Foster and her team with dirt and rocks. They continued working without pausing. Zethkar made detailed notes about this behavior. Most species valued medical personnel highly because of their specialized training. Doctors were typically kept far from combat zones where they could serve the maximum number of patients with minimum risk. Human medical staff seemed to operate by different principles. They placed themselves in danger to provide immediate care, rather than retreating to safety where they could help more people over time. This was mathematically inefficient but emotionally powerful. The tide of battle shifted when Colonel Nick Johnson's regiment flanked the Vorthak position from the east. Johnson's soldiers had marched through difficult terrain for 2 days to reach their attack position. They were exhausted, low on supplies, and facing fresh enemy defenders. Johnson attacked anyway. All companies, advance by bounds, he ordered. We hit them from 3 sides at once. The coordinated assault overwhelmed the confused Vorthak defenders. Without their command center and facing attacks from multiple directions, the aliens began withdrawing from their positions. Some dropped their weapons and fled entirely. By afternoon, human forces had captured the first Vorthak stronghold. The cost was enormous. Nearly half of Martinez's battalion was killed or wounded. But they had achieved something that Zethkar's tactical computers had calculated as impossible. War Prime Gorthek regrouped his forces at the second stronghold. His communications with the Vorthak High Command revealed growing concern about human capabilities. These creatures fight without regard for acceptable losses, Gorthek reported. They employ tactics that violate basic principles of warfare. Request immediate reinforcements. The response came quickly. Reinforcements are not available. Complete your mission with current forces. Zethkar reviewed his recordings of the day's fighting. Everything he had witnessed contradicted established military science. Human soldiers had achieved victory through methods that should not work against superior technology and numbers. Sergeant Campbell had somehow disrupted an energy shield with a primitive blade. Lieutenant Harrison had sacrificed his life for a single tactical objective. Dr. Foster had risked her safety to treat individual patients. Colonel Johnson had attacked despite being outnumbered and exhausted. Each action violated rational military doctrine. Yet combined, these irrational decisions had produced a stunning tactical victory. As night fell over New Austin, Zethkar began composing his daily report. He struggled to find words that would accurately describe what he had observed. How could he explain that primitive weapons had defeated advanced technology? How could he justify the effectiveness of seemingly suicidal tactics? His preliminary assessment suggested that human warfare operated by principles unknown to galactic military science. These beings fought not just to win, but as if defeat was simply impossible to accept. Tomorrow would bring new battles as human forces pressed their advantage. Zethkar realized his simple observation mission was becoming something far more complex and disturbing than he had anticipated. Principles of warfare itself. These humans fought as if death was acceptable. Defeat was impossible. The 4th week brought news that changed everything. A priority transmission reached Admiral Jake Collins aboard his command ship, and Zethkar intercepted the message that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Admiral, this is Earth Command. The voice crackled through subspace interference. We are under direct assault by Vorthak fleet elements. 3 colonies have already fallen. We need the New Austin force to return immediately for home defense. Zethkar expected Collins to begin immediate withdrawal preparations. Any rational commander would rush to defend his homeworld when faced with such news. Earth was humanity's birthplace and primary population center. Losing it would effectively end human civilization. Collins reviewed the tactical situation for exactly 14 minutes. Then he gave an order that made Zethkar's translator circuits malfunction from the emotional intensity of the human language. All ship captains, this is Admiral Collins. We have received word that Earth is under attack. I know every one of you wants to rush home to defend our families. But we're going to finish what we started here first. The bridge crew of Collins's flagship stared at their admiral in shocked silence. They had expected immediate course change toward Earth. Instead, Their commander was choosing to continue fighting on New Austin while their homeworld burned. "Sir," his tactical officer spoke carefully, "Earth Command is requesting immediate assistance. If we delay, if we run now, we'll be running forever," Collins interrupted. "The Vorthak want us to panic and abandon our objectives. They want us to scatter our forces chasing emergencies. That's how they've defeated 30 other species." Collins opened a fleet-wide communication channel. Every human ship in the system received his next words simultaneously. "People of the fleet, we all have families on Earth. We all want to protect our homes. But Earth isn't just a planet, it's an idea. The idea that human beings don't abandon their missions when things get hard. We finish this fight first, then we go home and finish that one too." The response from the human fleet was immediate and unanimous. Not a single ship requested permission to withdraw. Instead, they began preparing for the largest assault yet attempted against Vorthak positions. General Susan Clark implemented what she called acceptable losses doctrine for the ground campaign. Rather than preserving forces for future operations, she committed everything to immediate offensive action. The strategic reserve was deployed. Support units were converted to combat roles. Even medical and technical personnel were issued weapons and assigned to assault units. "We're putting everything on the table," Clark announced to her commanders. "No reserves, no safety margins, no fallback positions. We take their remaining strongholds or we die trying." Captain Pete Adams commanded a company that had been reduced to half strength through previous fighting. His soldiers were exhausted, their equipment was failing, and they faced an enemy force that outnumbered them 10-1. Standard doctrine required them to wait for reinforcements or better tactical conditions. Adams ignored standard doctrine. "We attack at dawn," he told his company. "I know the odds look bad, but we've got something they don't understand. We've got each other and we're not backing down." His soldiers began preparing for what everyone knew would be their final battle. They cleaned their weapons with methodical care, wrote letters to families they might never see again, and shared personal items with comrades who might survive to carry their memory home. Private Johnny Miller gave his wedding ring to Sergeant Davis. "If something happens to me, make sure my wife knows I was thinking about her at the end." Corporal Sam Wright distributed ammunition from his personal reserve to soldiers whose supplies were running low. "Take extra clips. We're going to need every round." These preparations fascinated and horrified Zethkar. Most species facing impossible odds would attempt to negotiate surrender terms or find ways to escape the situation. These humans were preparing to die fighting, and they seemed almost comfortable with that prospect. The final assault began before sunrise. Adams led his company directly at the Vorthak Command Center, the most heavily defended position on the planet. Enemy plasma fire cut down soldiers with every step, but the advance never wavered. "Keep moving," Adams shouted over the sound of explosions. "They can kill us, but they can't stop us." The human assault was mathematically impossible to succeed. Zethkar's tactical computers had calculated the odds at less than 1%. The Vorthak had superior numbers, better positions, and overwhelming firepower advantage, yet somehow, the humans kept advancing. When Adams fell with plasma burns across his chest, Sergeant Davis took command and continued the attack. When Davis was killed by a direct hit from artillery, Corporal Wright led the remaining soldiers forward. When Wright died at the enemy barricades, Private Miller picked up the company flag and kept advancing. By the time human forces breached the Vorthak Command Center, only 6 soldiers from Adams' company were still alive. They had accomplished their mission at a cost that would have broken any other species. Yet they planted their flag on the enemy position and called for reinforcement to hold their ground. War Prime Gorthek watched his command center fall from his backup position. He had been a professional soldier for 40 years, participating in successful campaigns against dozens of species. He understood tactics, logistics, and military psychology better than most commanders in the galaxy, but he did not understand humans. "How are they still fighting?" he asked his tactical advisor. "Their casualties exceed acceptable limits by any standard. They should have surrendered weeks ago." His advisor, a veteran of many campaigns, had no answer. "Perhaps they do not understand mathematics, War Prime. Their behavior violates all principles of rational warfare." Gorthik had been receiving increasingly desperate messages from his superiors. Other Vorthak operations were being delayed while resources were diverted to New Austin. What should have been a quick conquest was consuming an entire battle fleet and tying up forces needed elsewhere. The psychological impact on his soldiers was becoming critical. Vorthak troops were trained to fight rational opponents who followed predictable patterns. They could handle enemies who were stronger, faster, or better armed, but they had no training for opponents who simply refused to accept defeat under any circumstances. War Prime, his communications officer, reported, were receiving surrender requests from frontline units. This was unprecedented. Vorthak soldiers did not surrender to inferior opponents. They were disciplined professionals who followed orders regardless of personal cost. Yet entire squads were laying down their weapons rather than face another human assault. The breaking point came when Corporal Mike Stevens volunteered for a mission that terrified even his fellow humans. The Vorthak had established a final defensive position in the planet's industrial complex. The facility was protected by automated defense systems that could destroy anything approaching from ground level. Stevens proposed to infiltrate the complex through the underground maintenance tunnels. The tunnels were filled with toxic gases, unstable machinery, and automated kill systems designed to prevent exactly such infiltration attempts. No rational person would attempt such a mission. Stevens was not operating by rational principles. "I can get through," he told Colonel Johnson. "It won't be pretty and I probably won't make it out, but I can disable their defenses from inside." Johnson tried to talk him out of the mission. "Son, those tunnels are death traps. Even if you reach the target, you'll never make it back to our lines." "Don't need to make it back, sir," Stevens replied. "I just need to get there and flip the right switches. Once their defenses are down, you can take the complex with a standard assault." Stevens entered the tunnel system carrying enough explosives to level several city blocks. Zethkar tracked his progress through sensor readings as the human crawled through passages that would kill most life forms within minutes. Toxic atmosphere, extreme temperatures, and mechanical hazards made the tunnels uninhabitable. Stevens kept moving. When his protective gear failed, he continued without it. When poisonous gases began affecting his judgment, he followed pre-planned routes written on his arm in permanent ink. When automated defenses wounded him, he crawled forward on his hands and knees. He reached the central control room after 6 hours of impossible travel. His body was failing from multiple toxins and injuries, but his mind remained focused on the mission. With shaking hands, he planted charges on the primary defense computers and activated the detonation sequence. The explosion destroyed the Vorthak defensive network and opened their final stronghold to human assault. Stevens died in the blast, but his sacrifice eliminated the last major obstacle to human victory. Colonel Johnson led the final attack personally. His forces were reduced to company strength, but they moved with the confidence of soldiers who had seen the impossible become routine. They had learned that determination could overcome technology, courage could defeat superior numbers, and sacrifice could achieve any objective. The Vorthak defenders broke before the assault even reached their positions. These professional soldiers had been psychologically shattered by weeks of fighting opponents who simply would not quit. They surrendered en masse. The third week of conflict brought changes that made Zethkar question everything he knew about warfare. Human forces had not only survived their initial victories, but were actively expanding their control across New Austin. What should have been a brief mop-up operation for the Vorthak was becoming a prolonged campaign with uncertain outcomes. Colonel Nick Johnson's regiment had been cut off from main human forces for 6 days. Vorthak reinforcements had surrounded his position in a valley between 2 mountain ranges. All supply lines were severed. The regiment was running out of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Standard military procedure required immediate surrender to preserve the lives of his soldiers. Johnson ignored standard procedure. "Command, this is Falcon Regiment," he transmitted on an open frequency that both sides could hear. "We're still in this fight. Send the next wave when ready." War Prime Gorthek intercepted the transmission and responded with an offer of honorable surrender. "Human Commander, you are surrounded and cut off. Your position is hopeless. I offer terms that will spare your soldiers' lives." Johnson's reply was broadcast across all military channels. "Come and take it." Zethkar had heard similar defiant statements from other species, but they were usually followed by quiet negotiations for surrender terms. Johnson meant every word. His soldiers began preparing defensive positions as if they intended to fight indefinitely. The Human Engineering Unit, commanded by Corporal Tony Walsh, began performing miracles with salvaged equipment. They stripped parts from damaged vehicles to create new weapon systems. Mining lasers became anti-aircraft guns. Cargo haulers were converted into armored fighting vehicles with welded steel plates and mounted machine guns. "Sir, we've got 3 more plasma cannons operational," Walsh reported to Colonel Johnson. "They're built from parts we pulled off destroyed Vorthak vehicles." Zethkar checked the technical specifications of Vorthak plasma weapons. They were sophisticated systems that required advanced manufacturing facilities and rare materials. It should be impossible for primitive human engineers to repair or modify such equipment. Yet Walsh's team was not only repairing captured weapons, but improving their performance. They increased the firing rate by bypassing safety systems and boosted power output by removing limiters. The modified weapons were dangerous to operate, but they gave human forces firepower comparable to their enemies. Major Kate Robinson commanded a special operations unit that had been conducting raids behind Vorthak lines. Her soldiers moved like ghosts through the night, striking supply convoys and communication centers before disappearing into the wilderness. The psychological impact on Vorthak forces was severe. "Ghost leader to all units," Robinson transmitted during one raid. "Primary target is the ammunition depot. Secondary targets are fuel storage and communication arrays. We go in silent and come out loud." Robinson's team infiltrated a heavily guarded Vorthak supply base using nothing but basic camouflage and careful timing. They avoided electronic sensors through simple techniques like covering themselves with mud and moving only during shift changes. Once inside the perimeter, they planted explosive charges throughout the facility. The simultaneous detonation destroyed enough supplies to support an entire Vorthak division for a month. The raiders escaped in the confusion, leaving no trace of their presence except the burning wreckage. Vorthak soldiers began showing signs of severe stress. They jumped at shadows and fired at imaginary targets. Guard duty became a nightmare of constant alertness with no clear enemy to fight. Some defenders requested transfer to other assignments rather than face another night of uncertainty. The breaking point came when Private Danny Torres was separated from his unit during a chaotic retreat. His platoon was falling back under heavy enemy fire when Torres was wounded and fell behind. Standard procedure required leaving wounded soldiers who could not keep pace with the withdrawal. Torres understood this. He had been trained in the same doctrine as every human soldier. When retreat was necessary, the mission came before individual lives. He expected his comrades to leave him and continue their withdrawal to safety. They tried to obey orders. Sergeant Martinez ordered the retreat to continue despite Torres's situation. But as they reached the strategic bridge they were defending, the platoon stopped. Without discussing it, they turned back for their wounded comrade. Torres saw them coming and tried to wave them off. "Go," he shouted. "Complete the mission. I'll be fine." But Torres was not fine. He was badly wounded and could barely walk. Vorthak forces were advancing rapidly toward his position. In minutes, he would be captured or killed. His platoon reached Torres just as enemy soldiers appeared on the opposite side of the bridge. There was no time for a careful evacuation. The only choice was to fight a delaying action that would likely get them all killed. "Hold this position," Sergeant Martinez ordered. "We don't give ground." Torres, despite his wounds, took up a defensive position with his rifle. Blood loss made him dizzy, but his aim remained steady. When the first Vorthak soldier appeared in his sights, Torres fired without hesitation. The battle for the bridge lasted 3 hours. Torres and his platoon faced overwhelming numbers with limited ammunition and no hope of reinforcement. They should have been overrun in minutes. Instead, they held their ground through tactical superiority and sheer determination. Torres, unable to move from his position, became the anchor point for their defense. His accurate rifle fire kept enemy forces at a distance, while his comrades maneuvered for better positions. When Torres finally collapsed from blood loss, his body was surrounded by empty ammunition cases and fallen enemy soldiers. He had fired over 200 rounds with deadly precision while mortally wounded. His sacrifice bought enough time for civilian evacuees to cross the bridge to safety. Zethkar reviewed the bridge battle in detail. By every mathematical model, Torres and his platoon should have failed within minutes. They were outnumbered 5-1, had limited supplies, and included a critically wounded soldier who should have been evacuated immediately. Yet they had achieved their objective and saved hundreds of civilian lives. The cost was enormous. Torres died and most of his comrades were wounded. But they had accomplished something that tactical computers calculated as impossible. The psychological impact on Vorthak forces was devastating. They had thrown a full company against one wounded human and a handful of soldiers. The humans had held their position until civilian evacuees were safe, then withdrawn in good order despite their casualties. War Prime Gorthek filed increasingly desperate reports with his superiors. The humans do not follow rational military doctrine. They achieve objectives through methods that should not work. My forces are becoming demoralized by their unpredictable tactics. The response from Vorthak High Command showed growing concern. Complete the mission immediately. Other operations are being delayed while you deal with primitive opponents. Gorthek tried to explain the situation, but his superiors could not understand his difficulties. On paper, his forces were superior in every measurable category. The humans had inferior numbers, primitive technology, and no apparent tactical advantages. What the Vorthak leadership could not grasp was that humans seemed to operate by different rules entirely. They achieved success through methods that violated basic principles of military science. Staff Sergeant Chris Baker's demolition team exemplified this problem. Baker had volunteered for a mission that was clearly suicidal, destroying a Vorthak orbital defense platform that protected their remaining strongholds. The platform was heavily defended and positioned in space where human forces had no tactical advantage. "Sir, we can't guarantee success," Baker told his commanding officer, "but we can guarantee we'll take that platform with us." The mission required Baker's team to fly a heavily loaded transport ship directly into the defense platform. They would detonate their explosive cargo on impact, destroying both the platform and themselves in the process. Most species had volunteers for dangerous missions, but they typically expected some chance of survival. Baker's team knew they were signing their own death warrants. They volunteered anyway. "It's what needs to be done," Baker explained to his men. "If we don't take out that platform, the fleet can't establish orbital superiority. Without orbital support, ground forces will be overrun." The logic was sound, but the willingness to die for strategic objectives was something Zethkar had never observed in other species. Even the most warlike civilizations tried to preserve experienced personnel whenever possible. Baker's team launched their mission at dawn. Zethkar tracked their approach toward the orbital platform through his sensors. Vorthak defenders responded with heavy fire, but the human transport continued its collision course without deviation. The explosion was visible from the planet's surface. Baker and his entire team died instantly, but their sacrifice eliminated the orbital defenses that had protected Vorthak positions for weeks. Within hours, human orbital bombardment began falling on enemy strongholds. The tide of battle shifted dramatically as Vorthak forces lost their protected positions and faced attack from space. Zethkar realized he was no longer documenting a conventional military conflict. He was witnessing something that challenged the fundamental. They fought not because they enjoyed violence, but because they had decided that fighting was necessary. They sacrificed. Not Zethkar sat alone in his quarters aboard the Silent Watcher, staring at a document that could change the course of galactic history. His final report lay complete on the screen before him, but his finger hesitated over the transmission key. Once sent, this information would reach every military command in known space within days. The report was comprehensive, detailing human military capabilities that defied conventional understanding. He had documented their tactical innovations, psychological resilience, and most disturbing of all, their apparent immunity to normal battlefield psychology that caused other species to surrender when defeat became inevitable. His preliminary conclusions were terrifying. Human warfare operates outside established parameters of rational military doctrine. These beings demonstrate capability to continue fighting regardless of casualty rates, supply shortages, or tactical disadvantages. Recommend immediate diplomatic contact and extreme caution in any future military engagements, but Zethkar could not bring himself to transmit the report. He had spent the final week conducting interviews with both human survivors and captured Vorthak personnel. The conversations revealed patterns that made his blood run cold with implications he was only beginning to understand. Admiral Jake Collins had agreed to a formal interview about human military philosophy. The admiral sat across from Zethkar in a temporary command post, his uniform showing the wear of weeks in combat zones. Despite the stress of commanding a desperate campaign, Collins appeared calm and professional. "Admiral," Zethkar began carefully, Your forces suffered casualties that should have ended effective resistance. Yet you continued fighting. How do you explain this capability? Collins considered the question for a long moment. We didn't see them as casualties. We saw them as payments toward something worth buying. I don't understand that concept. Every soldier who died bought time for others to complete the mission. Every sacrifice purchased a chance for victory. When you look at warfare as a transaction rather than a contest, losses become investments instead of defeats. This economic metaphor for human lives disturbed Zethkar greatly. Most species valued individual survival above abstract objectives. Humans seemed capable of calculating the worth of their own existence against intangible goals. But surely there must be limits, Zethkar pressed. At what point would you consider the cost too high? Collins smiled grimly. There is no cost too high when the alternative is surrender. We'd rather die fighting than live knowing we gave up. Dr. Amy Foster provided additional insights during her interview. She had treated wounded soldiers from both sides throughout the campaign, giving her unique perspective on comparative military psychology. The Vorthak soldiers were professionally trained and competent, she explained. But they fought because they were ordered to fight. Our soldiers fight because they choose to fight. That makes all the difference. How so? Orders can be disobeyed when conditions become impossible. Choices remain valid regardless of circumstances. A Vorthak soldier follows commands until following becomes impossible. A human soldier keeps his commitments until he physically cannot continue. Foster's observations aligned with Zethkar's own analysis. Human military effectiveness seemed rooted in psychological mechanisms that operated independently of external conditions. They were, in effect, immune to the despair that caused other species to surrender when victory became mathematically impossible. Colonel Nick Johnson offered perhaps the most chilling insight during his interview. Johnson had commanded forces through some of the most desperate fighting of the campaign, yet showed no signs of the trauma that had broken War Prime Gorthek. Colonel, you witnessed thousands of soldiers die under your command. How do you process such losses? Johnson's answer was immediate and confident. I don't process them as losses. I process them as examples of what humans can accomplish when we decide something needs to be done. But these were your friends and comrades. Yes, and they chose to die for something they believed in. That's not a tragedy. That's the highest honor any soldier can achieve. I'm not mourning their deaths. I'm celebrating their choices. This transformation of death into inspiration was a uniquely human psychological adaptation that Zethkar had never observed in other species. Most civilizations were traumatized by massive casualties. Humans seemed energized by them. The interviews with captured Vorthak personnel revealed the other side of this psychological warfare. These professional soldiers, trained and experienced in dozens of conflicts, had been psychologically shattered by their encounter with human determination. They never stopped, one Vorthak squad leader repeated obsessively. We killed their friends, destroyed their equipment, surrounded their positions. They never stopped attacking. How do you fight enemies who don't understand when they've lost? Another prisoner, a veteran of 20 successful campaigns, described his growing terror as the conflict progressed. At first we thought they were just stubborn. Then we realized they weren't going to surrender no matter what happened. That's when the fear started. War Prime Gorthek, still under medical care for his psychological breakdown, provided the most detailed analysis of human military psychology from an opponent's perspective. They weaponized their own mortality, he explained during one of his more coherent moments. Most species fight to preserve their lives. Humans fight as if their lives are ammunition to be expended for tactical advantage. How do you defeat enemies who consider death acceptable as long as it serves their objectives? Gorthek's strategic assessments were particularly disturbing. He had identified human psychological patterns that could potentially be replicated by other species, turning the galaxy into a battlefield where surrender became impossible and conflicts would continue until one side was completely exterminated. If other species learn to fight like humans, Gorthek warned, warfare will become total destruction rather than limited conflict. There will be no negotiated settlements, no honorable surrenders, no preservation of defeated populations. Wars will end only when one civilization completely destroys the other. This possibility haunted Zethkar as he reviewed his completed report. The human model of warfare could spread through the galaxy like a virus. infecting other species with psychological patterns that would make conflict infinitely more destructive. But there was another possibility that terrified him even more. What if no other species could successfully adopt human psychological patterns? What if these mental frameworks were unique to human evolution and culture? In that case, humans would possess an insurmountable military advantage over every other civilization in the galaxy. His report contained detailed recommendations for immediate diplomatic contact with human leadership. The Galactic Council needed to establish peaceful relations before humans, decided that other species represented threats to be eliminated rather than neighbors to be accommodated. The evidence suggested that humans were capable of treating defeated enemies with compassion and restraint, as demonstrated by their care for Vorthak prisoners. But it also suggested that they could sustain military campaigns indefinitely if they decided such action was necessary for their survival or principles. Zethkar had included intercepted communications showing human colony ships launching toward distant star systems even while the New Austin battle was still raging. These beings were expanding their presence throughout the galaxy while simultaneously fighting a war that should have consumed all their attention and resources. The final section of his report contained a recommendation that made his hands shake as he typed it. Immediate establishment of permanent diplomatic relations with human leadership. Priority classification. Galactic security issue. Recommended approach. Full accommodation of human territorial and resource requirements. Alternative approaches not advisable. In simple terms, Zethkar was recommending that the Galactic Council give humans whatever they wanted to avoid military confrontation. His analysis suggested that humans were essentially undefeatable through conventional warfare, making negotiation the only viable option for coexistence. But as Zethkar stared at the transmission key, he realized the implications of sending this report. Every military command in the galaxy would receive detailed analysis of human capabilities. Some would undoubtedly attempt to develop countermeasures or preemptive strikes. Others would try to forge alliances for mutual protection. The result would be galactic-scale conflict as civilizations either tried to destroy humans before they became too powerful, or sought human protection against their neighbors. In either case, Zethkar's report would trigger the very wars it was intended to prevent. He thought about the human soldiers he had observed. They had fought with courage and determination, but also with honor and restraint. They had cared for their wounded enemies and treated prisoners with respect. They had fought to defend their territory and principles, not to conquer or destroy other civilizations. Perhaps humanity deserved the chance to develop without the entire galaxy conspiring either to destroy them or manipulate them for military advantage. Zethkar made his decision. He deleted the detailed analysis of human military capabilities, the psychological P. The battle for New Austin was over, but Zethkar's nightmare was just beginning. As human forces secured the planet and began processing their prisoners, the full scope of what had happened became terrifyingly clear. These beings had not simply won a military victory, they had fundamentally broken the rules of warfare itself. Admiral Jake Collins stood in the ruins of the final Vorthak stronghold, reviewing casualty reports that should have ended human resistance weeks ago. His forces had suffered 80% losses during the campaign. Entire units had been wiped out. Critical equipment was destroyed or beyond repair. By any mathematical standard, the humans should not have been capable of continued operations. Yet they had won decisively. "Admiral," his aide reported, "we're receiving surrender offers from Vorthak positions across 3 star systems. They want to negotiate terms immediately." Collins nodded grimly. The psychological impact of the New Austin campaign was spreading through Vorthak military commands like a plague of fear. Word was traveling that humans could not be defeated through conventional means, that they would continue fighting regardless of casualties or tactical situations. Dr. Amy Foster worked tirelessly in the field hospital, treating both human and Vorthak wounded. The alien soldiers seemed confused by receiving medical care from their former enemies. Most species executed or abandoned captured opponents rather than expending resources on their recovery. "Doctor," a wounded Vorthak soldier spoke through a translation device. "Why do you help us? We are your enemies." Foster looked up from the plasma burn she was treating on the alien's arm. You're wounded. That makes you my patient, not my enemy. This simple statement revealed something that made Zethkar's recording equipment malfunction from emotional overload. Humans could switch from deadly combat to compassionate care without any apparent psychological difficulty. They could kill enemies without hatred and heal them without conditions. Colonel Nick Johnson's regiment had been tasked with securing Vorthak prisoners and processing their surrender. Johnson treated the captured aliens with professional courtesy, despite the weeks of brutal fighting. He ensured they received adequate food, medical attention, and protection from revenge-seeking human soldiers. "Sir," Sergeant Davis questioned privately, "these prisoners killed a lot of our people. Some of the men are asking why we don't just—" "Because that's not who we are," Johnson interrupted. "We fight when we have to, but we don't murder helpless prisoners. The moment we start acting like animals, we become no better than the worst of our enemies." This distinction puzzled Zethkar greatly. Most aggressive species maintained their hostility toward defeated opponents. Humans seemed capable of immediate transition from maximum violence to principled restraint. War Prime Gorthek remained under medical supervision after his psychological collapse. Human doctors had diagnosed severe stress-induced trauma and were providing treatment despite his attempts to coordinate their destruction just days earlier. "I don't understand," Gorthek kept repeating to anyone who would listen. "I have studied warfare for 40 years. I have conquered 30 species using proven tactical principles. How did primitives with inferior equipment defeat professional soldiers?" The human psychiatrist treating him, Dr. Helen Murphy, tried to explain concepts that had no equivalent in Vorthak military doctrine. "Your people fight to win," she said gently. "Our people fight because fighting is what needs to be done. When winning becomes impossible, you look for alternatives. When winning becomes impossible, we look for ways to keep fighting." Gorthek stared at her with 6 eyes that showed no comprehension. "But that is irrational. Soldiers who cannot win should surrender to preserve their lives for future battles." "Maybe," Murphy agreed. "But sometimes there are things more important than individual survival. Sometimes the mission matters more than the people carrying it out." This conversation was recorded by Zethkar's surveillance equipment, and it would later become the foundation for his most disturbing conclusions about human nature. These beings had somehow transcended basic survival instincts that governed all other known species. Captain Pete Adams survived his wounds and was recovering in the same medical facility as the former Vorthak commander. Despite losing most of his company in the final assault, Adams showed no signs of the trauma that had broken his opponent. "Captain," a reporter asked during an interview, "you led your soldiers into an impossible battle. How do you live with the responsibility for their deaths?" Adams considered the question carefully before answering. "I live with it by remembering that they chose to follow. Every one of my soldiers was a volunteer. They knew the odds, they understood the risks, and they decided the mission was worth their lives. But surely you feel guilt for their sacrifice." "I feel honored," Adams replied. "Those soldiers trusted me to lead them in something that mattered. They gave everything they had for their comrades and their cause. How could I feel anything but pride in their service?" This response demonstrated another disturbing aspect of human psychology. They could accept enormous casualties without the guilt or trauma that paralyzed other species. Instead, they transformed loss into motivation for continued effort. Major Kate Robinson continued her special operations missions even after the official end of hostilities. Her teams were now focused on hunting down war criminals and securing abandoned Vorthak equipment. The transition from combat to peacekeeping required no adjustment period or retraining. "Ghost leader to all units," she transmitted during one operation. "We're switching from search and destroy to search and rescue. Same skills, different objectives." Her soldiers adapted instantly to the new mission parameters. Humans who had been killing enemies with ruthless efficiency were now protecting civilians and providing humanitarian aid with equal dedication. The most disturbing discovery came when Zethkar reviewed communications intercepts from human forces. Throughout the campaign, soldiers had been writing letters to families back on Earth. These personal messages revealed the psychological framework that enabled their impossible battlefield performance. Private Danny Torres, who had died defending the strategic bridge, left a letter for his mother. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home. Don't be sad for me. I got to serve with the finest people I've ever known, and I died doing something that mattered. That's more than most people can say about their lives. Sergeant Roy Campbell, who had broken the first Vorthak energy shield with nothing but a bayonet, wrote to his wife, "I don't know if we'll win this war, but I know we won't lose it. Americans don't give up, and neither do I. Whatever happens, tell our kids their father fought for something bigger than himself." Lieutenant Ben Harrison, who had flown his damaged fighter into the enemy command tower, recorded a final message for his squadron. "By the time you hear this, I'll be gone. But don't mourn for me. I got to fly with the best pilots in the galaxy, and I got to make a difference when it counted. Take care of each other, and keep flying." These messages revealed that human soldiers understood their likely fate but chose to continue fighting anyway. They were not driven by bloodlust or hatred, but by attachment to abstract concepts like duty, honor, and service to others. Staff Sergeant Chris Baker's demolition team had left similar messages before their suicide mission against the orbital defense platform. They expressed love for their families, pride in their service, and determination to complete their assigned tasks regardless of personal cost. The psychological profile that emerged from these communications was unlike anything in Zethkar's experience with other species. Humans could simultaneously acknowledge their mortality while choosing to risk everything for principles that existed only in their minds. Corporal Tony Walsh continued his engineering work after the fighting ended, but now focused on rebuilding infrastructure rather than creating weapons. His ability to improvise solutions from available materials had not diminished with the change in objectives. "We broke a lot of things during the fighting," Walsh explained to his crew. "Now we fix them. Same skills, better purpose." This adaptability extended throughout human forces. Soldiers trained for destruction could immediately redirect their efforts toward construction. The psychological mechanisms that enabled effective combat could be instantly repurposed for peaceful objectives. Corporal Mike Stevens had died in the tunnel system during the final assault, but his personal effects revealed the same pattern of principled sacrifice. His letter to his parents read, "I volunteered for a mission that probably won't end well for me, but it needs to be done and I'm the right person to do it. Don't think of this as losing a son. Think of it as your son choosing to matter." These personal accounts painted a picture of human warriors who were fully aware of the consequences of their actions, but remained committed to their chosen course. They were not naive or ignorant of death. They had simply decided that some things were worth dying for. As Zethkar compiled his observations, he realized that he had documented something unprecedented in galactic history. The humans had not won through superior tactics, technology, or numbers. They had won through the application of psychological principles that no other species seemed capable of utilizing.